This is complete whiplash from Hypermedia Systems.
Yes. Yeah.
Hypermedia Systems is very much like a love letter to a kind of quirky technology written by three huge nerds, and I use that term affectionately. And then this, like you were saying, Nathan, is just absolute corporate jargon, very, very meta, right? Because you're solving people problems around technology, not technology problems. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toops. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, as always, if you're listening on YouTube, you can like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on an audio platform, you can leave a 5-star review. And no matter where you're listening, share it with your friends and coworkers or your fellow students or just anyone who's interested in software engineering. Really helps grow the podcast. And we are excited this week. We are tackling Team Topologies. This is a book that has come up quite a bit in other books we've read, and a lot of the authors we've had on have mentioned Team Topologies. So this is kind of one that's been looming large in the background, and we tackle it this week. We'll do the author and book introduction in just a sec, but Nathan, how does it feel kind of finally getting around to Team Topologies?
Hey, yeah, it feels like we've had this on our to-do list for a while, and I understand why it's on everybody's list. So this is great.
Absolutely. I'm going to mention it a bit later, but I feel like you see a lot of this book's DNA in a lot of the other books we've read. So it's very cool, kind of cool to trace the genesis of a lot of those ideas. So what is Team Topologies? We'll start with the book introduction, then we'll do the author introduction. So Team Topologies describes itself as effective software teams are essential for any organization to deliver true value or deliver value continuously and sustainably. But how do you build the best team organization for your specific goals, culture, and needs? Team Topologies is a practical step-by-step adaptive model for organizational design and team interaction based on 4 fundamental team types and 3 team interaction patterns. It is a model that treats teams as the fundamental means of delivery, where team structures and communication pathways are able to evolve with technological and organizational maturity. And it is written by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais. Matthew Skelton is the co-author of Team Topologies. He's the head of consulting at Conflux. He specializes in continuous delivery, operability, and organization dynamics for software in manufacturing, e-commerce, and online services, including cloud, IoT, and embedded software. I think that's just everything: manufacturing, e-commerce, online services, cloud, IoT. Maybe he's not doing space technology.
Hey, if you're a consultant, you got to throw a large net. You know what I'm
saying? Manuel Pais, the other co-author, he is recognized by TechBeacon as a DevOps thought leader. Manuel is an independent IT organizational consultant and trainer focused on team interactions, delivery practices, and accelerating flow. Manuel is also a LinkedIn instructor on a continuous delivery for the enterprise. So that's kind of our introduction to Team Topologies. Nathan, so we read part 1 and 2 this week. We'll be tackling part 3 next week, but give us your thoughts on parts 1 and 2 of Team Topologies.
Yeah, so if you've heard us talk about Conway's law or the inverse Conway maneuver, we brought this up in the Unicorn Project. Most of our interviews with ThoughtWorks folks and any of the books from the ThoughtWorks world, I think that's where a lot of the recommendations came from. This is the authoritative text on anything Conway law related. As you also heard from the interview, though, from the intro, though, very, very thick in corporate word soup. If you are not trying to solve this domain of problem, if you're not in this point in your career, this might be something you skip. If you are in the midst of like, how does the intersection of technology and humans interact, is incredibly valuable. That's how I'm looking at it so far.
This is complete whiplash from Hypermedia Systems.
Yes. Yeah.
Hypermedia Systems is very much like a love letter to a kind of quirky technology written by 3 huge nerds, and I use that term affectionately. And then this, like you were saying, Nathan, is just absolute corporate jargon, very, very meta, right? Because you're solving people problems around technology, not technology problems. You had mentioned, and and I agree, or you have it here in your notes at least, that it has great case studies, which I really enjoy. I think this book is like it's like the textbook version of the Unicorn Project, right?
Yeah. Actually, this is an excellent compliment to the Unicorn Project.
Absolutely,
yeah,
it was fun to read the Unicorn Project, and then I read this. I'm like, oh, like a lot of the ideas the Unicorn Project was teaching in parable format, this is just teaching straight up. But there are great case studies within it to kind of drive home the points. You can tell this book is very foundational, which surprises me because it was written in 2019.
Yeah.
But it has had a big impact. Its DNA's in a lot of the other books that we've read, especially like you said, the ThoughtWorks people, Unicorn Project. But something I'd love, and we'll talk about this throughout the discussion. This book was written in 2019, so it is a pre-pandemic book, and it shows.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
I would love a second edition that touches more on remote work, because this book, it treats remote work how it was in 2019. It's kind of like, well, if you have to have remote workers, or
or it's a novelty. Like they did bring up
exactly,
and it is on our backlog. But there's a book called Remote, and it's by the folks who started 37 Signals.
Nice.
So DHH and Freed. Both of them have like they had like a kind of a quirky. It's basically like the Hypermedia systems book of remote work, which was a novelty. But I think it's actually become like a playbook for how a lot of companies operate now. So
yeah, and like you said, this book kind of treats remote work as a novelty, which I just thought was funny considering how much it's increased since the pandemic. But still very interesting. This book's kind of a quick read. I think the first 125 pages, we did about 125 pages this week. We're doing 60 next week. So, it's one where I think if you've got the time, and we'll talk more about this recommendations, but it's a good book to read, and we're excited to discuss it. So we're going to have lots more to talk about with Team Topologies right after the break. And we are back. Thank you for tuning in. Well, let's talk about some of the core concepts that are, at the heart of Team Topologies. First off is Conway's Law. Nathan, why don't you give the audience kind of an overview of what Conway's Law is?
Yeah, so this is actually a quote from Melvin Conway. This goes all the way back to 1967. So this is not a new idea, but it's a very powerful idea. So it has longevity. If the architecture of a system and the architecture of an organization are at odds, the architecture of the organization wins. So this is an idea that organizations will design systems that mirror their structure of their org, and that this is, if you try to fight against this is where problems emerge, right? So if you see Google's building software a certain way, or one of these other software companies, and you go, why can't we build software this way? Compare your org charts, right? Compare the way that people communicate and do these things. And so when you give this framing, it's super powerful. And it kind of shows, like, I think there was one of the sections of the book, they were joking that, like, if you have four separate teams working on your compiler, you'll have a 4-step compiler.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's just that's why the design decision emerged. And this is also with the rise of microservices. Microservices can work quite well if your org is set up to support microservices. It's a complete nightmare if your org is not. So that's another kind of piece to it.
So then we come to what they call the reverse or inverse Conway maneuver, which is the idea that, like you said, Nathan, you can't fight against it. If you're trying to build a certain type of software and your teams are structured in a way that just won't allow it, what you need to do is not yell at your teams more. You need to break up the teams. You need to build teams in in that format. The classic example they give is, and I think they talk a lot about, like, the inverse Conway maneuver and Conway's Law. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too new in my career, because I'm trying to find examples of when I saw, like, oh yeah, Conway's Law really manifested in this way for me, and it was a big nightmare. Because kind of the classic example they give is, like, listen, if you have a back end team, a front end team, and a whatever, and like a database team
and a QA
right
team, right? Like you,
and a
like
QA team.
the classic breaking out by discipline. Yeah.
Exactly, right. You're gonna, create 4 independent, tightly coupled systems, right? Whereas if you kind of split those up and had, 2 back end, 2 front end, 2 database, and a QA engineer on every team, then you'll create, microservices essentially, which can be deployed and scaled independently. At every place I've worked at, that's been how it works. The only thing I can think of is when I worked at a cloud provider and we had a separate front end team, but they did front end for like everything.
Right.
I don't know.
And I actually think this even meets that because of how complex visualizing across all the teams are and why they want a consistent thing. They have a framing of like the 4 team types that are ideal, and you could even argue that the UI team at that cloud provider was a complicated subsystem, right? Like there's so much domain expertise and like what was there that and they talk about there's certain teams that should live independently as a complicated subsystem. Like at my organization, we have a runtime virtual machine. So like it interprets smart contracts and does these things. Well, that's a very specialized group that like understands how to parse abstract syntax trees and understands like what runtime errors are going to be. And there's no way that all of us could become like experts in it. So there's this like subset system team. I will say this is not without controversy. Some people really like Carl from Internet of Bugs. He's not a fan. He's seen this fail. And he's
really?
He's a contrarian, right? So it's like really interesting to hear his takes. But there's this idea that from the ground up that you could change the organizational structure. We see a beautiful rosy tale of this in Unicorn Project, trying to affect change. And they basically like, despite the shape of the organization, create inverse Conway team to like scrappy, make things happen. I think where I've experienced this a lot, where these kind of maneuvers and Conway's law kind of butts up against is if you're in a very fast growth early stage startup, the startup doesn't know how to organize itself yet. And the way it did will change over time because the type of customer that they have, product market fit, pivots, all these things change. A lot of times too, you're having people that are more junior in their career going into leadership and then having to figure out how to be a leader as they go. All of these things are going to affect, Conway's law. The other one is legacy organizations, right? Companies that it used to be that technology and IT was a cost center and they kind of like patched it on at the end, or it was, regretfully there. Maybe they tried to outsource it. Maybe it's back to the United States. They're kind of in these like throes of like, how do we even structure ourselves? And again, I think that's where probably the most of this corporate consulting comes from, is like, oh, you're a parts manufacturer, but everything's online. How do I restructure so that I can be innovative and compete with, Google and Amazon and stuff?
Yeah, you're right that a lot of these consultants, like that's their bread and butter, right? Is they're going to your Home Depots or your Auto Traders or your whatever, and you're helping them make the transition to become more online. If you've worked at a lot of just online first companies, they'll use examples from either places I've worked at or places that are close to what I've worked at and be like, this is the ideal way to do it. And I'm like, oh, like I kind of didn't realize
you're
other
spoiled.
people weren't doing it. Yeah, exactly. Right.
And a lot of those companies figured this out over the last 15 years, right?
Oh,
so
absolutely.
Like, if you're in the workforce now, there's enough scar tissue and enough learning internally, and there's enough cross-pollination of engineering leadership across these companies that there's a survivorship bias in that these best ideas win, right? These best ideas win, they stick around. Are they, and it really comes down to this, is this useful? And they talk about the trade-offs here. There is no one size fits all. And they're really clear about that, is that it might be because you're a highly regulated entity, or because you have a bunch of technology partners outside of your company, or there's logistics with how you do manufacturing overseas and then do stuff here in the United States. Like all of those constraints are Conway's law constraints, and you have to structure the organization around that. And so these are interesting considerations. Yeah.
So the meat and potatoes of Team Topologies is the Team Topologies, and so they list 4 types of teams. These are not definitive, and no other type of team exists, but they kind of say that these are for all 90% of use cases, 95% of use cases. Your team should resemble one of these 4 team topologies. So we can go through them. The first is the stream-aligned team. It's a primary team type. This works directly on business domain features and delivers value to end users. This is the most common type of team, I think. When you hear of a team, this is what you're thinking of. I have worked.
You're building features directly for the product that
exactly
are driving business value, right?
Right. When I think about my career, I mean, this has been most of the teams I worked on. Right now, you can debate whether or not I'm a platform team, but I don't think so. I think I'm still a stream-aligned team. When I worked for a food delivery company, I was on the post-purchase experience team. And so we kind of managed everything post-checkout. So refunds, reviews, order tracking, things like that. And yeah, when I was at the cloud provider, even though we didn't have the front end, we were the back end for one of the cloud provider products. And so yeah, this is a stream-aligned team. How about you, Nathan? You have experience in stream-aligned teams?
Yeah, so I've mostly not been in this team.
Interesting.
So I've mostly been in a set of the other ones, and we can talk about them in a second. Though if you're not in a stream-aligned team, you're supporting a stream-aligned team. Like that is the other 3 teams are sort of domain expertise to make sure that the stream-aligned team is unblocked as much as possible. You really want a stream-aligned team in an ideal world to be as focused on their stream as possible, and the stream being a domain of expertise. They talk about too much context switching or too many complicated streams that they working on, actually making them kind of like diluting them into incompetence. But yeah, it's interesting. That being said, I'm actually developing a stream-aligned team right now. I've been kind of put into, so I'm a software architect, but I'm actually managing sort of like as a tech lead or as a directly responsible individual, a new greenfield project. We have 2 new hires. We're actually like spinning up this new, very user-centric, user journey oriented sort of culmination of several of the products that we're working on, looking at this like initial use case, which again has been really cool because it's fun to do stream-aligned work because your output, you get a very tight feedback loop and you can measure things really easily. Like, I think that if we do this, user churn is going to go down. Or I think if I do this, the number of sales conversions goes up, right? Like these, you can measure something, it's very visible and it affects the business in a very positive way. The other teams, and we'll talk about those, they're maybe it's a little more indirect and harder to measure.
Absolutely. Okay, so that's our stream-aligned team. And now we've got the platform team. So these are teams that enable stream-aligned teams by providing internal services and tools that reduce cognitive load. Now, Nathan, you were saying that this has been a lot of your work. Is that correct?
So platform team is cool. I like to think a good platform team, and I think a lot of companies aspirationally have platform teams. It's like the direction we've gone in. But this is the sort of lineage of like systems administrators turned site reliability engineer turned platform engineer. So as the DevOps methodology has evolved, and it's interesting, the DevOps methodology actually has driven a lot of this. And you'll talk about like the beginnings of Team Topologies really emerged from these DevOps methodologies trying to figure out how to enable stream-aligned teams. Platform teams have gotten to this really interesting point now where they're basically building internal Herokus, right? So the joke is, all company maturity at some point makes it so that you have an internal Heroku. And by Heroku, again, I know that they're like yesteryear, but Heroku basically said it function as a service, the original function as a service kind of folks. All I want to do is like handle my little piece of business logic. I write the code, it passes the CI/CD, it deploys automatically, right? This like very tight loop. I can run it locally. I can get it running through and doing the rest of my test pipeline. A good platform team enables new projects to spin up quickly. So a company shouldn't have to like sit with the DevOps folks for 3 weeks, figuring out how to provision a new database and figure out how to like get a new service and get it. This goes through the unicorn project where there was like all this red tape if they just want to do one new thing. A good platform team should make it the cost of ideating new ideas really cheap, super, super cheap. Now, do you get to go into production automatically? Probably not, right? There's probably some gatekeeping saying, okay, we're going to let you go run in the sandbox or the dev playground, but you got to, maybe go jump through some hoops. It's a fun game, and I think that a good platform engineering team can kind of be thought of as like special ops, right? So you have a lot of boots on the ground. They're doing a lot of important things, very structured, very stream oriented, right? If you think about like military, special ops is these super highly skilled, very like they understand the greater context and they can like swoop in and just like do special things over and over and over again in a lot of different places. Like, so special ops might operate in a lot of different contexts, navigating uncertainty, wrapping their head around the norms of how other teams operate. And so there's a lot of empathy and like meta programming that goes into this. It emerged out of software site reliability engineering, in that this is Google's answer to DevOps and SR and like DevOps and systems administrators would said, what if we had programmers solve ops problems? Like, what if we approached it with an engineering first approach, which is what's revolutionized the whole industry. Before, it was kind of like these gatekeepers that said no all the time, and kind of put up a bunch more and more steps to avoid change to the system. And a platform engineer does the opposite and says, if we're having to get involved on a daily basis, we did something wrong. Like the stream aligned teams should be able to like go do their own thing and operate independently.
It's funny with DevOps, because my first programming job was in 2017, and even that was part-time in school. So my first full-time job begins in 2018. And I think that's kind of the DevOps revolution is either happening or kind of ending, or ending in victory. So when I don't know, the old way of doing things seems so funny to me, that you would build something and throw it over a wall to operations. But at the first company I worked at, which was an entertainment company, there was still a little like old school thinking there. And I remember a lot of the engineers being very frustrated that we had on call, and there was talk about like getting an operations team to manage this. And when I was first starting out, I was like, hey, that sounds great, because then I won't have to be on call anymore. And only looking back, I'm like, oh, that's so funny that we were even considering that. The answer should have been make on call less painful.
Right.
Because our on call wasn't even that painful. And I don't think, I've never worked on a platform team. I mean, the current team I work on, we are building a platform, but it's an internal platform for marketers. So that's more a stream-aligned team. We've got the complicated subsystem team.
Yeah.
So there's another team topology. These teams own and maintain components that require deep, specialized expertise. The examples they give: algorithms for trading, recommendation engines, complex mathematical models. Their goal is to reduce cognitive load on stream-aligned teams by encapsulating complex technical domains that would be too challenging or time-consuming for stream-aligned teams to handle alongside their regular work. Have you ever worked on a team like this, or have experience working with a team like this?
I have not, but as a platform engineer, I've supported them, and it's really interesting, right? So if you're wondering where these strange, like, you may have heard of these specialized programmers, maybe like somebody who's a quant, like quantitative trading, folks in AI, anybody with like PhD level research. I've seen teams where they have like PhDs in physics, but they're solving some juicy matrix multiplication, weird, statistical stuff. These folks, it's interesting. Some of them will be structured more like research labs. Some of them are, very deep in the finance stuff, or some really just technically advanced piece of tooling. Like we had one that was like literally we were building a database. These were the founders of this company were like former database engine engineers. And so that's how they worked. And so they had a very specialized team that like they understood when like queries materialize and all the intricacies of like when does certain events happen and how do things get parsed. they're fascinating. They're kind of what you think of as these like wizards and graybeard kind of
Yeah.
folks. But they're also interesting. It takes a cognitive load off the Streamline team. So that's the ultimate goal is don't go back to being like a DBA where you're gatekeeping. Oh no, database decisions can't happen here. It's literally if you get to like a juicy part of the business, it's probably some sort of core technology. Like in our case, again, we're an open source project, but we do these interpreted Go on the blockchain. That's like kind of our thing. Well, to interpret that Go, we have to have a VM that it runs in and does all these special things. Well, that's a very specialized knowledge. And there's probably like 3 or 4 folks that are literally just thinking about that all day. Like that's the kind of problems that they're working on.
Yeah, I've never been on a complicated subsystem team. I wouldn't want to be on a complicated subsystem team. A streamline team, that's what I like. I like it being kind of as close to the customer as I possibly can. The example of a complicated subsystem team I was thinking of is when I was at one of the large cloud providers. We had what was called the substrate, because you think, right, like if you like, AWS, for example, EC2, right? If you want a server, what you do is you provision an EC2 instance, right? But the people making EC2 can't provision an EC2 instance to run their technology, right? So what there was the substrate, which was kind of like the bare metal
interesting
version, right? And so EC2 can't run on EC2, it has to run on the substrate. And so there was a whole team that was kind of building, they built and maintained the substrate. So even though it was we still consumed it kind of via API,
right?
It was not, the cloud provider's cloud, server offering.
I would also imagine like really complex systems like Amazon has the IAM or identity access management. That is a very complex beast, and its correct behavior across all systems really matters. And so adding a new feature to it, I would imagine the ability to reason about the system is like incredibly important. And while everyone has to kind of be familiar with it and use it as a consumer, they're serving these streamlined teams where like those teams any streamlined team should be able to just use IAM and not think about it too much. Like maybe, test my policies work. But if you're adding a new AWS service, you probably have to describe all these new IAM constraints that you might have, right? Like who's allowed to read and who's allowed to write, and does this have a batch command, and like all these other kind of things that modifies the IAM system as a whole. And
it would have been fascinating to find out who was working on like the IAM or IAM equivalent, because I don't know. You're right. Like I don't know if they would function more like the substrate team or if they would function, because IAM is a frontline product, and so if they would function more like a streamline team, I'm not sure. But that would have been really interesting to figure out.
Yeah,
hey, if you work at
that's a good point.
Cloud provider on your IAM offerings, message us because we'd love to know.
Yeah.
So, and then last we get to enabling teams. These teams are temporary consultants that help streamline teams acquire new capabilities. They actively work to understand the problems streamline teams face, then help bridge knowledge gaps through coaching, mentoring, and creating resources. Their goal is to increase the autonomy of streamlined teams, often make themselves unnecessary for that particular capability over time.
Yep.
In my experience, this is one of the team types that goes poorly more often than the other team types.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. And it's interesting too, because like I'm serving sort of a dual purpose right now. So like I'm leading this streamlined team. This is brand new stuff. But up to this point, I was really more a part of enabling.
Interesting.
As a software architect, right? I was literally just like floating across teams, kind of making sure that the architecture of stuff is meeting our larger goals, and maybe a lot of times advocating for simplicity. Like, hey, we actually don't need, like, this is clever, but we actually don't need it to be that complex. Like, let's try this, minimalist version. Or like working with, I did this too, like working with the DevOps team to like run ideas, like, being like, hey, these patterns are really useful, and they go run with it and I go run away, right? It's like, it's just kind of interesting. But I think you have to be pretty mature and have some pretty senior expertise.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you don't, this is really when I think like if you start hitting things like distinguished engineers or these kind of level, that's what they're mostly doing enablement work, right? They may not be in the day-to-day code, but what they are doing is like translating senior leadership's ideas, or even maybe some of their philosophical ideas into a path for the engineering to be successful. Make sure that they don't, hit these hit these gaps.
You're talking about distinguished engineers, just reminded me of something that happened yesterday at work where I had to send out all these messages to people we have this resource that we need people to associate Slack channels with them now so that we can do automated notifications. So I have a script that I use to generate the message, and then was just kind of copying and pasting it into Slack. And because I couldn't get the Slack API, I couldn't get the permissions for the Slack API to work. So I did it by myself. Anyhow, so I send out like 170 Slack messages, and then as I'm working through the responses, a lot of people are very, very helpful. One guy just responds like LOL, and then he's like, "What's my timeline?" I'm like, "That's a funny response." And then I looked it up. It was the chief operating officer, and I messaged him kind of like, "Hey, can you make sure to attach this Slack channel?" He's like, "What's my timeline?" And I realized who it was. And I said like, "Well, to be honest, I didn't realize I was messing with the chief operating officer. So for you, I imagine the timeline is whatever you want it to be." And he was like super nice and got it taken care of really quickly. As far as enabling teams go, this, I think you have to manage that balance. Like you said, Nathan, expertise really helps here, because I found that these teams can either become impotent or too powerful. They either become very, like, they dictate the terms of the technologies you are allowed to use, or they don't have any real authority, and so they're just kind of like, pretty please, can we help you? This was the very first team I was on out of college. People hated our guts, which was not fun.
Interesting. What was the... So were you literally called enablement, or what was
we were called reference architecture? And so the idea was that we would create. So I like, honestly, I was reading this, and this came out in 2019, and that was around the time when how reference architecture was structured changed. And I had the thought, like, it was like our VP came and like met with all of us and like announced this big change. And I was like, I'm reading this now. I'm like, did he read this book? Is that what happened?
That's
Because yeah, we turned into more of a kind of a classic enabling team. So we're called reference architecture. Some of the things we did that were good were we created, like I mentioned this before, we had like UI component libraries, right? So the company had a pretty strict style guide. And so if you wanted to use a date picker or a drop down or whatever, it was helpful. You could use our component libraries. We had scaffolding. So if you wanted to spin up an Angular application that was already hooked into the company's authentication system and whatnot, you could just kind of clone our project and scaffold out of that. I'm trying to
This is interesting. I would actually argue that that's more of platform than enablement. So in my mind, enablement should actually be the inverse of that, which is that the goal is to get streamlined teams to not have to like increase their autonomy. And so if you have a centralized library, that's the opposite, right?
Well, but then here's where I think it creeped into being more of like an enabling team is we had veto power over lots and lots of technical decisions that were being made. Like, we were allowed to say,
but I would say that was disenablement.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying, right? Like
it's like an Orwellian use of the word enablement,
right? And so maybe you're right. Maybe it's not an enablement team. Maybe this is just not one of the 4 team topologies, and that's why it got canned. Because
I think you might actually have an example of where the Conway's law runs into issues. Is that this reminds me more of like a traditional ops team that would say no, right? Like, it'd be like, oh, can I do this? No, because this is our way of doing it.
Yeah.
And there might be reasons for that historically. And I think there's also a lot of fear that if a team makes decisions for itself, it's going to make the wrong decisions, right? Like, there's this fear.
That was very prevalent.
And I think that's pretty normal because, well, what this really gets down to is you hired the wrong people, right? Like, and that's a much harder conversation to have, which is like, if you can't let the team operate autonomously and you can't put out a guideline that says, hey, look, this is how we design stuff. And then they keep breaking things or doing crazy redesign stuff. Like, you're literally got the wrong team members.
Yeah.
And I've been in that world too. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I did work at UT Austin. I was a systems administrator.
Oh,
we just said no all the time. We just literally just said no all the time. And a lot of it is because there's regulatory red tape, or there was little fiefdoms that they're like, oh, well, you can't do this because chemistry actually has their own funding and grants, and they already got part of their grant. They hired a DevOps person, and so we can't step on their toes. It's just like all this like political infighting. And so that's interesting.
We would do open source software reviews. Like, if you wanted to pull in a new package with npm. You would have to submit it to us. And just to give you an example of like how completely broken this was, that was my job as the intern, was to review the open source software recommendations, right? And say like, oh yeah, you can use this. And I was just like, I don't know how, when that task got kicked off to the intern, we didn't shut the whole thing down and be like, what on earth are we doing? And
That's
maybe that is what happened, because eventually we did become much more like we lost the, you know, with the carrot and the stick, they took the stick away, and we became pure carrot, and just we had to make our the things we designed useful enough that people would want to use them. So yeah, I think you're right. Maybe that was some weirdo team that didn't even fall into one of these topologies.
And again, this is an ideal of how, so if you follow this methodology, and again, I'm trying to think, I've never been in the cool, like, mature startup world that you've been in. And I think maybe these boundaries have been more clearly defined. There's always a work in progress. I've definitely been where we have strong feature teams and we have strong, streamlined teams and strong platform teams. Like the platform stuff is amazing. Complicated subsystems. Enablement, I think you're right. I think companies get a little confused as to what this is. And I think we get into this idea of, we've talked about with other books, it doesn't bring it up in this book because I don't think the term was coined yet, but in the fundamental software architecture, they talk about orthogonal coupling. I think that an enablement team that actually uses, hey, this is the standard structured log pattern, we really encourage you to use this because you get access to all these other systems. That's a self-service approach, right? It says, hey, if you do this thing, look at all the cool, wonderful things that you unlock in your world, and not, you must use this or we're going to shut your project down, right? Like if you switch to that, you're like, all of a sudden this enablement team seems really mean. And you're like, we don't want to do that because it's a stupid pattern. And we're going to go on tread our own water because it's we're the unicorn project team and you don't understand how much better things can be.
This company was also infamous for the ratio of like employees to contractors. Like it was like maybe 30% employees, 70% contractors. And these contractors were in-house embedded. But I didn't realize that was strange when I showed up. And I won't badmouth them by name, but if you know, like they were in like the New York Times for firing their employees and then forcing their H-1B visa contractors they hired a bunch of H-1B visa contractors and then forced their employees to retrain. That was the condition of their severance, was they had to retrain their cheaper replacements.
Little H-1B visa tangent, and not to get too into politics, but we could fix that entire program if you just had to prove that you're not paying H-1B visa people less than you're paying U.S. citizens. Like you're literally making the argument that these are so exceptional that we have to hire talent from overseas. Pay them better. Like
I agree.
If they're truly exceptional, pay them better, and then it completely inverts the thing. Otherwise, you really are using this like indentured servant thing where you're dangling a visa over somebody, which is not fair.
When I worked at a large cloud provider, almost all of my coworkers were H-1B visa holders. And let me be clear, I mean, excellent engineers, wonderful people,
absolutely.
right? Yes. But what makes it challenging, as there were two things that made it challenging as as an American citizen. One, we had special work that only American citizens could do. We had special government regions and so we had a special American citizen on call rotation that was always understaffed. And so whenever we brought on a new H-1B visa person, I was just a little like, you're only supposed to hire this person if you can't find an American to do the job, and they also can't do a part of the job that an American has to do. So I always found that a little strange. But two, and this is just the way the incentive structure works out, right? Like if you get fired or laid off from your job, you get deported. Right? You have like 60 days to find a new company who will sponsor your visa, which is a nightmare sponsoring a visa, right? Or you get deported. Of course, you're going to work 60 or 70 or 80 hours a week, right? Like I do not blame the visa holders. That is exactly what I would do in that situation. But I think that's why these companies love it so much, because you get someone that if you fire them, you have to kick them back to India or China or Pakistan or wherever, right?
Yeah.
So I find it like, I just think these coworkers I worked with, smart, exceptional people.
Right.
I say, if they're so smart and exceptional, let's let them come here and work for whatever company they want to work
Exactly.
for.
No, it's
you know?
purely upside. I mean, that's the thing is, if we fix this in a like humanistic centered way, it's wonderful. And I will tell you, like, yes, I've worked with plenty of H-1B visa folks, and it's such a cool opportunity. It's nice to do a cultural exchange. It's nice
Sure,
to
yeah,
like
yeah.
do all those things. But I hate that they're using this as like this bargaining chip for
Yes.
manipulation. And I'm like, that does need to end. We need to make it easier to get H-1B visas for exceptional people that are, paid competitively and are not mistreated. If we could do that, that's literally what the American dream is for. Like, so
Oh,
anyway,
absolutely.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
So that's our take on the H-1B visa hubbub. And then that is the 4 types of teams that they lay out. We'll just stream-aligned, platform, complicated subsystem, and enabling teams. Yeah, I mean, we really wanted to cover, like, that is the meat of the book, and then we're going to talk about kind of other interesting ideas we found throughout that relate to that. But I thought this was helpful. I mean, this isn't, again, one of those things where it's kind of cool to read this book after you've been in the field for a long time, because you recognize the patterns. You say, like we just did, we're like, oh, I worked on that kind of team. I worked on that kind of team.
Yep. And you can see how much this has influenced the industry over the last 6 years too.
Absolutely.
This book particularly, people keep bringing it up, and it's a better framing than the other books that have talked about the topic. And so yeah, we'll get into that after the break.
Well, we're going to talk about, more of those interesting topics. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. And we are back. So we've talked a lot about the how and the what. What are the team topologies? What are these teams you can form? We could talk about the why now, which is, I mean, what might you see in your business? What might be the trigger point where you might say, wait a minute, what we're doing isn't working, and maybe I got to reform my teams? I mean, Nathan, the book mentions some of that. I mean, what were your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, so the first part of this book really focuses on teams, right? So they even go as far as to say, work shouldn't be assigned to an individual by the organization. It should be assigned to a team. The team should be responsible for divvying that up amongst their team members, right? It's a very clear separation. And you'll see it get into ideas like domain-driven design or domain-driven development. And that they say anytime you're deviating away from this team-first approach, you're going to run into problems, right? Without being prescriptive of like which team you should be on or how the individual things are be structured. The first part of this book also frames this within Conway's law and says, oh, if your team looks like this, maybe it's because your org was set up this way. And I guess the third part of the first section, they're really focused on like team first thinking. And I think that's the area that was like where it starts to get juicy to me. I'm a big like servant leader, sort of egalitarian approach to leadership. I think most teams thrive when they have that kind of leadership because it empowers the individual, but the team shares the reward and the pain, right? That you want to minimize cognitive load on your team, but you also want to maximize the productivity, the flow state that they're in. And unlike Uncle Bob, this is very pro flow state, maximizing flow state as a team. But yeah, I thought this first section was great because again, it's pretty short relative to the whole book. I think it's like the first 25 pages or something. It's very dense with really useful framing. And I think if this book is nothing else, it's a framing book. Like this is masterfully framed. It's like, I'm going to make this statement as to why this is true. Here's a case study. And here's what happens if your team's not doing this. And I appreciated that structure.
I thought it was cool. They mentioned Spotify a lot.
Yeah.
And I thought it was neat the way that Spotify does their teams. I don't remember the exact terminology. I think they called each individual team is a squad, and
they have tribes.
Tribe. Okay. Yeah. So basically,
squads are the smallest unit. Yeah.
Squads are the smallest unit. They were saying that basically, if a squad has a hard dependency on another squad, that's allowed to be, but they must be within the same tribe. Mm-hmm. And if you start noticing your squads are having hard dependencies on squads outside of your tribe, that's a sign that something's gone wrong, and maybe you need to reorganize. Amazon comes up quite a bit here, and I think Amazon does a lot of stuff wrong when it comes to how they manage and treat their employees. But one of the things they actually do really well, I think, is the 2 pizza team. The idea that, about 8 engineers is kind of the max. A number of engineers you should have on a team. They should be able to deliver independently. You should organize problem spaces around that. I really like this version of teams. I think 8 is a good number. I think when you get smaller, it's smaller. It can be tough to have all the people you need to get all the stuff you want done. Bigger, it's just too much to manage, both for the manager and also they mention Dunbar's number, which I need to look up the exact. What we got. Yeah.
Well, yeah, go ahead. Do you have it looked
basically,
up?
It's the idea that humans can maintain stable social relationships with about 150 people. And then the book itself.
And it's almost like this Russian doll sort of piece where you can only have these high trust relationships with it's as few as 5. And then you have this like slightly larger group. And each one of them is like, I think it's like a times 3 or a times 5 multiple up to the 150 of like, the shell of the like super high trust. Then it's like I can rely on them, and then like I know them, and then like I can interact with them.
Dunbar found 15 to be the limit of number of people one person can trust deeply. From those, only around 5 people can be known and trusted closely. I'm going to trust Dunbar on this. I am not a sociologist. Because I was reading this and I was kind of curious. I'm like, well, does my wife, is she using up one of these?
I think so. I think if a healthy marriage definitely uses one of those slots.
But I'm like, my parents, well, there goes another 2, right? And it's just kind of like, well, I can't trust any of you.
Well, but not everybody has high trust with their parents. And some people don't have high trust with their spouse, right? Like I think it's this capability piece which also is interesting just from like a abstract standpoint, who you pick to be in this high trust group will deeply impact you. If you pick untrustworthy or unreliable people, but they're in your inner circle, that's complete chaos in your life, right? I think anybody who's like had a close family member or someone close in their circle who ends up having substance abuse problems, why it will derail your life, right?
Absolutely.
And so in an organizational structure, if you have a high trust group but you don't trust your team, like, oh, I talked to you in confidence, and then they go, oh, somehow my skip found out about this, and you're like, what? I was just venting, whatever. This is going to affect the team topology. It's going to affect the way that the team structures. One of the things I loved that this book advocated, and it goes into the Dunbar rule, is that you should use small teams that are long-lived, and that's the standard. And there's actually this Alan Kelly quote that says, disbanding high-performance teams is worse than vandalism. It's a corporate psychopathy.
Yeah.
And I think this is true because I've been on teams where like we did this thing, mission accomplished, and they broke us apart. This actually happened at my last company, and it drove me nuts. I was working very closely with this German DevOps team, and they were amazing folks. And the team I went to next was also great. But we fired on all cylinders. We made this thing happen so fast. We were able to make decisions. We had this incredible high trust. We accomplished our mission. And they're like, great, go fix a bunch of other things. We're breaking your team up. And I'm like, are you insane? Like, this is like getting the Beatles together and then being like, oh, you're all very talented. Go start 4 bands. And you're like, don't do that.
But that's totally management thinking. It's like, wow, we've got these 4 great musicians. Imagine if we split them up and paired them with 3 maybe not as good musicians, right? And now we can have 4
then we'll have
pretty
4
good bands.
Yeah, we'll have 4 Beatles bands, and then they're gonna make 4 Beatles bands each, and like all of a sudden we're like the best. We're gonna like take over all of music, and you're like, that's not how this works. That's.
Hey, you want my big brain career advice with Dunbar's number? So you can only trust a certain number of 5 people closely, and you're wasting that on your marriage, on your parents, on your brother. What I say, sabotage your marriage. Don't trust your spouse, because now you can trust your manager or your fellow developers even more deeply.
Wow.
That's
wacky,
straight.
Wacky Wednesday. Yeah.
That's quality advice.
It's Carter's advice for life.
Sabotage your marriage to further your career.
But it is interesting, and maybe there's with the Dunbar's number of 15 trust relationships, right? Like, I might highly trust people within a work environment, but I wouldn't trust them with my bank account or my plans for the future, right? And so like I think there really is this like ultra high trust group where I'm like, okay, if I want to stay at this job and I'm happy, or if I actually want to like bug out in 5 years. I'm not telling my boss that. I'm also not going to tell the rest of my team that maybe I think that the software is ugly and that maybe we're going the wrong direction as a whole company. If I don't have a high trust thing there, right? Like you basically have to like figure out how you can navigate those things.
I'm looking it up. Robin Dunbar, he's still alive.
No way.
He's written some books.
No way. That's awesome.
Let's read Robin Dunbar's books and then get him on the podcast so we can ask him if we need to choose between our spouses or our coworkers.
And yeah, oh gosh, he'd be like, "What? You don't understand anything,
moron."
But yeah, so I think this is again a really good breakdown of like you read the Unicorn Project and you read these things and you're like, I mean, that makes sense in the story of this parable, but like, how do I really do this in real life? This first section of the book really shows you how to build these high trust teams. And a lot of that too is also like making sure that you share the reward. This is something that I've always really tried to do. Like if I was on a team with like a tech lead, making sure that they get credit, that the whole team gets credit, but it also indirectly makes the team lead get credit for like doing something great. And then if it's a good team lead, they'll make sure to spread that reward amongst the team as well. Like, oh, if they get a shout out for doing something awesome, they go, oh, well, I couldn't have done this without my team. Like we're just firing on all cylinders. We love solving this type of problem. That helps cohesion so much. If you all feel like, oh man, like I'm impacting change in the organization. And
we have to talk about just briefly, and this is not the main point of this book, but it cracked me up. There is a point, like I said, this is a pre-pandemic book, and so it's obviously in-office culture is what dominates pre-pandemic. But they're talking about like, okay, what's the ideal, or not the ideal offices, but they're talking about how can you organize your office to facilitate collaboration. Yeah. And they use one of these case studies, and I listened to most of this book on audiobook, and when I heard this, I was in the shower, I paused it and picked up my phone and read because I was so shocked that this was being used as like a positive example.
Right.
For me, I was like, this is insane. They were saying like, oh, it's great. We got rid of individual desks. We offered lockers, and we had like basically like everyone sat at like a big picnic table. I didn't know. I was trying to figure out if it was like legit benches, like you didn't even get something to lean your back against all day. But like, and everyone sat at like a big long bench. And then another example they gave was like, oh, like, and then we got rid of the extra monitors. Like, so it was common for some technical staff to have 2 or 3 monitors, so this was not popular. But it's an interesting example of becoming a digital organization by actually restricting the use of technology in order to meet the goal of being more collaborative. I don't see how getting rid of your monitors makes you more collaborative. It was just the office they were describing. Like, if I were interviewing with a company and I walked in and saw this office, like, I would have walked out and been like, wow, there's no way that I'm working here. So for me, I thought this was nutso.
Right.
But I don't know. It just kind of cracked me up.
Yeah, I think, this is another important piece, is that the individuals that are joining a company, these kind of things do matter. If there's a non-starter, if you're doing these sort of cafeteria, picnic table style setups, and I think they did have like little mini whiteboards subdividing sections and things like this. Yeah, I was in an early stage startup. We had a lot of constraints, budgetary constraints, right? On like what workspace did we have? And we were in person. This is obviously way pre-pandemic. It's like 2015 to 2017 is when I was doing this. And we did have this, but we had a bunch of social norms on like, if you have your headphones on, that means don't interrupt me. We had to have a cadence for when we were doing whiteboarding sessions. We also had, we were in one of those co-working spaces, so we had a dedicated office. In the co-working spaces, they had a bunch of like isolation pods where you could like, if you needed a quiet place, you could just go reserve it, or sometimes you just grab it, and you needed this like, enclosed thing that nobody got to. It has had deservedly a lot of criticism, and I think we were solving a like business expense problem and not necessarily a what's the ideal environment to make the most productive team possible problem. It didn't drive me crazy, and maybe it's because I was in the C-suite, so it was like I drank the Kool-Aid and just put my comfort blanket on and said this is how we do things. But we were very collaborative. We were kind of doing cross-team stuff, and so we would have these ad hoc things that would pop up, and it was great for us. If I was doing like deep focus work, if I was in an area where I needed to think about the AST for some whatever, that would be a nightmare. Like I'd probably be somebody who's sitting in one of the pods all day, or asking to work from home because I can focus more, which is something we ended up doing. I think it was like 1 or 2 days a week. We started experimenting with work from home, and then measuring productivity off of some places that we had it. And of course, our team was like, you always want to prove that working from home is like useful. And so it was kind of fun because people would work from home and then get a lot done.
Yeah.
And then be like, and so it was a good like way for us to do it. After that, I actually transitioned into fully remote work. I've been doing fully remote since 2017.
Oh, wow.
And I love it. I feel very productive. You have to be self-motivated.
Absolutely.
You have to be the kind of person that's able to do this and to do the check-ins, right? Like, can you force yourself to be social online with and then does your company honor this in that, like, again, there's no example of this in the book because the remote was not that common, but like the best remote companies have a pretty good offsite cadence, right? They're basically like, let's gather, let's go do something, let's come up with our plan for the next quarter, for the next half of the year, and then go back and do our stuff. And
our company's full remote. We do offsites about 4 times a year, and one of those offsites is the big company. Like everyone from the company flies in, and
we have something similar, and it's great. It gives us a cadence to go, okay, you know what? I've got a big idea for my team, or I have a big idea that we can present to a larger group, and it gives you this thing to like shoot for when everyone gathers.
Yeah, and it helps put a name to a face, and yeah, I really like remote work. I said on the podcast before, but I'm not anti in office. I consider myself a social guy. I am anti commute and anti living in Seattle or San Francisco. So I like that I've been able to work at some cool companies without having to leave Utah, which is just, it's where it's where I was born. It's where my parents live 20 minutes from me. We really like it for our kids. So I'm not super interested in up and moving to a bigger city. So remote work has been really valuable for me. There are challenges with it, obviously. Like I'm the first to admit that it's collaboration is harder. Collaboration is harder, but deep work is easier. My take with remote work too is just that it's, we just need a market, right? I think there are people who want to work in an office, and that's fine. There should be companies that do that. There are people who want to work from home. I get frustrated when I feel like people are kind of putting their thumb on the scale a little, and I was going to say either direction, but really it's the in-office culture, right? Like occasionally you'll see like people who own office real estate putting pressure on the government to get people to return to office, and that always grinds my gears. But it's I'm also bullish on remote work just because it's a benefit that costs negative money to offer, right? And people like it. I think it's really funny that Google's offices were kind of famous back in the day for, I remember seeing them, like picture them in magazines because they had slides to get from floor to floor, and they have nap pods and a masseuse and all these, a ball pit or whatever, like crazy things. And then even Google, when they made these offices, like had to really tighten the leash and demand that people return to office after the pandemic. It's not like these offices were so cool that people were like, I got to get back to that. And I think it's just funny that like people made these crazy offices, and then it turns out what all of us wanted to do, or most of us, was work out of our spare bedrooms.
Right. Yeah. And it is interesting, because again, if you have boundaries, I've also seen folks who transition to work from home and that are workaholics, and they have a really hard time turning the screens off, right? That's never been a problem of mine, but I've seen folks where I'm like, they don't know that they basically used going to the office as a cue and then going home as a cue to like separate those two pieces. And if it's just one room away, or you're worried about some urgent deadline or things like that, you'll break that boundary if you're not careful. And so I think it's the way it works best for each of us can shift. So this gets into this. I think one of the last sections of the book that I think is really, really interesting, and I think would be worth talking about before we wrap things up, is boundaries. So this is a good transition. So one of they make this big case for like team first approach. Even how you structure stuff in the office, who gets interrupted. One of the big things that I've noticed is that in highly collaborative environments, especially, you end up getting these unofficial. Some people might call it cross-functional, but it's not really. It's really where like the manager of another team goes and directly engages with like a junior dev from another team and says, hey, can you do this thing for me real quick? Or can you do that? And of course, this book is basically like, this has to stop. And it's true.
Yeah.
First of all, your junior dev's not going to get acknowledged, or most likely will not get acknowledged. Secondly, it means that you're not able to properly plan how much bandwidth your team has because you're doing a lot of honeydew list items. And third, your junior dev might actually like agree to work that's not appropriate, right? Like you actually might be causing harm to both their career and to the organization because that other person skipped the process of understanding how to engage with the team properly. And they probably went to the junior dev because they thought, oh wait, the DRI or the team lead's going to turn me down, right? So I'm just going to go ask this person because they're cool. Like we had lunch and it was fun. I'm not saying you can never ever do those things, or if you're doing the unicorn project and you're like, hey, nobody's going to support CI/CD, let's do this. That's different. If you're doing this as a regular communication flow, it completely breaks how these team topologies should function. And so I would love,
Well, it's funny. The career advice I give changes depending on the state of the market, which like of course it should. But in the past, right? Because like it's frustrating, like to be at a unicorn project type place, right? Where like you have to form a rebellion, where you and like where you might have to like you said, like you can't trust your manager or your manager doesn't trust you or whatever. And so there's a lot of like cross collaboration or like poor collaboration across teams. In the past, I would say like just quit, go find a company where like they're not doing this,
Right.
But one, not everyone can quit all the time, and two, the market's a little frosty right now, and so you can't just necessarily up and quit and go find something, and also like you can't quit your job every 6 months or whatever. Well, I don't know, during the hiring boom in the pandemic, you probably could have.
Don't look at my LinkedIn because I job hopped way more than I wanted.
The hiring boom, it was just crazy. I would just go to one company like, wow, this company's pretty good, and then another company would come and offer me 50% more, and so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going there now. Anyhow, I sorry folks if you didn't get in on that hiring market. I hope that we see another one like it in our lifetimes. I am not optimistic, but also know it was a complete and total anomaly. That was insane. Anyhow, I think I've been fortunate to work at a lot of places where like this doesn't happen. Like that awful little startup I worked at was the only place where it really was happening.
I was like, at some point, the awful little startup
it will come up. Yes, and I quit. I quit after 3 months.
Right. Which smart move.
Well, again, it was the pandemic.
One of the things I loved, again, lots of framing in this book. They talk about types of monoliths, and so this was, I thought, again, really useful.
This has a lot of overlap with fundamentals of software architecture.
Exactly, and I will say I didn't really bring this up too much at this point, and I should have. As a software architect, is like my job at this organization. This is like an incredible handbook because I'm like, man, I keep butting up against this thing, and I really would like to introduce this pattern, and I'm like, oh wait, no, this isn't actually an org thing that I got to deal with, or no, this is how our org is structured. Is this pattern appropriate? Right? It gives me like some nice framing. So this is how basically team topologies can be violated in a way that you don't realize at first because you have hidden monoliths. And so the hidden monolith is this idea that like, for instance, application monolith, good example. Your application isn't really microservices, right? It's like a distributed monolith, right? And you can kind of know that this is true if the entire build and testing process has to happen monotonically, right?
Yeah.
Like if all your teams are doing your stuff, but to go out to deploy, the whole thing has to go out, you've got a hidden monolith.
Ken Beck, I've been thinking a lot in our interview, he said you can tell something's coupled if you use the phrase, be sure that. Right. Yep. Before you deploy this application, be sure that other team has deployed the latest changes. Well, now they're coupled. And if you're saying be sure that about several other services that need to be deployed, what do you have? A hidden monolith.
Exactly.
And it's actually worse than a regular monolith because at least a regular monolith, the rules of the game are clear.
Right.
But a hidden monolith, now, you're operating theoretically as microservices, but really you're a monolith.
Right. The joined at the database monolith. I liked this
Yep.
one. And again, we've talked about this a lot where like you might be microservices as far as these little applications, but they're all talking to the same database on the back end. And you're like, this
Mhm.
isn't really microservices.
Yeah.
If you have to, if you're having to check in, with the DBA and make sure that you don't break the schema because then
Mhm.
service B, C, and D are going to be broken, you got a monolith. Again, they talk about the build process. So like if I can't build my thing unless I build 5 other things, you have a monolith. And then there's also like coupled releases. We were so guilty of this at my last startup.
Oh, really?
It was awful. And like we would advocate for it and they're like, yeah, but what if one team independently deploys something and it breaks something? And I'm like, you roll that thing back.
Yes.
And then you figure out, you do a postmortem and you say, how do we do independent rollouts without breaking stuff? They're like, well, what about regulatory stuff? I'm like, okay, we can operate within the, and they talk about this too, fracture planes. That was the last like big concept that they talk about in this section. Because they're like, hey, okay, so if you want to decouple things or if you want to break up the monolith, how do you do this in the least painful way possible? And they bring up the stonemasons who know how to like tap a few spots and then it'll just like cleanly break, two big pieces of stone apart. And there's a whole section, and we're not going to get into the details on it, on like how to identify these fracture planes and use them to your advantage, right? Kind of jujitsu move of like, okay, this is how we break things apart with the least amount of effort possible.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of great stuff in this book. We're going to touch on the back half of it next week. But I've been enjoying reading it so far. We always wrap up with our standard questions. Nathan, so we've read the first half of Team Topologies. So what are you going to do differently in your career as a result of having read the book?
Yeah. So again, unintentional layup, but it's a total layup to what I just talked about. I, as a software architect, identifying these hidden monoliths for structure and process is really valuable to me. If I run up against some like juicy problem and I'm like, why do we keep running into this issue? Framing it within where's the hidden monolith, which also then shows you where's the hidden org structure, which gets you into Conway's law. This is something I'm going to start using as my divining rod or whatever to like figure out where the water is. So yeah.
I didn't realize it. So this isn't, it's not directly related to kind of the meat of the book, but reading this book, I realized I'm on a stream-aligned team, right? But we're not doing, because we're internal, we're not thinking of ourselves as a stream-aligned team, and we're not doing a lot of the more traditional stream-aligned work. What I was thinking about is like customer profiles, right? Like something that we think about all the time is like, who's using our product, right? And just because this week I had to message 170 users of the product, like I just want to be better about forming those customer profiles of like, okay, so we've got our power user, we have our marketer, light user, we have a database or like a data science user, who's helping a marketer, right? I bet if I sat down and thought about it for like an hour, we could come up with like 4 or 5 archetypes of the different users that are using the product. And then we could, when we're designing new features, it'd be nice just to kind of think about those 4 or 5 customer profiles. So just in general, like that's the concrete change I want to make, is try to come up with some customer profiles for our users, but also really think of ourselves more as a stream-aligned team. And we're getting away with some poor stream-aligned practices because we are internal and the stakes aren't as high. But really, we need to be functioning more like a traditional stream-aligned team that's delivering value to end users.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna start making some of those changes.
That's cool. I think that's a very like user-centric thing, which is again the book really drives home that especially streamlined teams, you have to be making these user-centric. It's also nice. Like I could see that being useful and being like, I'm gonna have to do this feature, and then you're like, oh yeah, it's the Jill the marketer profile. This would be perfect. And so then you go, okay, well I could measure it if Jill actually is able to like do this quicker, right? And it gives you this like nice like way of thinking about who am I serving.
And my hunch is that we might be designing most of our features with like one customer profile in mind, like the power user or whatever, and not enough with other users.
This is the thing my team and I'm now getting into the streamline stuff is like I've been doubling down because we're a very engineering led organization. We build a lot of tools for other engineers, but we're trying to get into sort of end user stuff. And I'm like, the bar's way higher. I was like, the bar's way higher in that they will abandon this if it's confusing, if they don't trust us, if there's friction. And so we actually have to very clearly identify the expectation and then go back and figure out what we're doing wrong. And that's not easy. It's,
I thought it was so funny. YouTube, I have YouTube Premium, and they gave me a little ad. It's like, oh, because you're on YouTube Premium, you can try some of our experimental features. And one of it was like, we have an AI conversational chatbot within YouTube, which like, I don't know why I would want that, but I thought it was interesting. I was like, oh, I wonder what that would be like on YouTube. And so I'm like, I'll give it a go. And so I clicked the button. It took me to a YouTube short explaining it. Maybe if I had watched the whole short, it would have explained how to use the button. But I was like, I don't want to watch this short. I want to watch YouTube. So then I'm just like looking on the interface for the button, like the conversational chatbot. I can't find it. And so I'm like, well, I guess I'll never know that feature. And it's just one of the things I'm like, man, like the engineering work of making this chatbot go, I bet it was so complicated, and people put lots of thought into it. But that last mile of, okay, how do we introduce it to the customer and how do we make sure that they know how to use it? Like they dropped the ball, which is sad. And I am 100% confident that we are doing the exact same thing on my team in some capacity, kind of dropping the ball with the final mile for our users.
It's hard. Making things
it's
simple,
really hard.
Making things simple is difficult.
Yep, absolutely.
So, I appreciate anybody who sees something that's like delightful to use or very simple interface. I'm like, so much work went into this. So much editing had to happen. Okay, so I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
Who would you recommend this book for?
Wait, you have to answer first because I just wrote that I agree with you.
Oh, that's hilarious. Okay. Yeah, there we go. So I think this is very squarely an engineering leadership book. I think that if you're anywhere from like a tech lead to software architect, engineering manager, VP or C-suite, right? You need to start thinking about how the team topologies works. If you might have frustrations with why is my org not able to perform the way I think they could, or we keep shipping bugs, or nobody's taking ownership of stuff, or my team's burnt out and I can't figure out why. This book literally is the playbook for solving these problems.
I wrote that I agree with you. Now thinking about it, I think I would also recommend it to any engineer who is either trying to make the transition to management or, kind of more, like you said, like tech lead, software architect, like more people management or people management adjacent. Or maybe if you're a very young engineer, but that's ultimately what you want to do is management. This could be a good book to read and kind of,
interesting.
Like you said, it's a framing book.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I didn't think early stage folks would benefit, but you're right though. And I would say the big caveat there is if you read the Unicorn Project, and I would actually recommend reading the Unicorn Project first because it's a more fun book, and that's literally for everybody. If you read the Unicorn Project and you're like, yeah, but how would I do that in my organization? Go read Team Topologies, right?
And the other thing with this, it's short. I think like the meat of this book is like 200 pages, and so I think if
we could have done this, and I think we could have done this in 1 week if it wasn't. There was some weird timeline stuff.
Yeah,
There's exams and other things that were coming up. It could be read in a week. It'll be fun to dive. The next part is it gets a little like more meta, and so I think it'll be fun.
And also, we talked about 20% of what's in this book, right? So
highly recommend.
Very, very good book. We're enjoying reading it. We recommend that you check it out, especially if you're one of the people that we just mentioned. But that wraps it up for this week. As always, you can find us on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. You can find us on any of the YouTube or your podcast players. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can find Nathan his work with Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperative.com. I usually do this wrap up. I just got to pre-record this wrap up because there's something I'm forgetting. Oh yeah. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. And you can also look at bookoverflow.io for all of the upcoming schedule. I found out, by the way, that the .io email or website domain might be going extinct. Have you heard of this?
I heard about this too. Yeah, Theo, like T3, has a whole thing on it. But yeah, it's
because it belongs to a country.
Well, it's actually it's like something like the Indian Ocean or something like
that. Yeah.
So it's like a weird contested thing that might get re-identified, and so therefore the TLD might go away. Like it's
Yeah.
well, and this happened with like when years ago when everybody was doing .ly, like Bitly was bit.ly, and it's like, well, there was a people's revolution in Libya, and so like
so you can't have that anymore.
All of a sudden, like all ly domains got shut down for a little while, and be careful with your novelty domains. That's all I have to say.
Who owns bookoverflow.com? I can't buy it. All right, that's it. We're renaming the podcast to Prime Brisket. I own primebrisket.com.
We just be like the cool kids and get a .gg or .xyz, you know.
Yeah, something like that. Well, okay. That's it for this week, folks. Thanks for listening to the episode, and we'll see you next week.